From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Is he the single most destabilizing leader in the world? Is Russia a criminal state with Vladimir Putin having stolen billions along with having enemies killed? Is Russia going back to the future with a Tsar? Today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell, Stephen Lee Myers is a 26-year veteran of the New York Times, including 7 years in Russia during that period when Putin consolidated his power. He was the New York Times bureau chief of Baghdad, covering the winding down of the U.S. military presence in Iraq. He now covers national security issues from theoretically safer confines in Washington, D.C. I guess it's only political wars there. His book, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Welcome, Steve. Great to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Brilliantly written book full of insight, and I like starting from youth on up, you see patterns of behavior that started pretty young. Okay, I want to ask you right off the bat, this guy's gone into Crimea, the Ukraine, Syria, the sort of the $64,000 question. Does he have some sort of strategic vision that he's implementing? Is it a tactical chessboard thing where there's not an overall strategy, but he's moving pieces, or is he just an impulsive risk taker, maybe not even rational?
You know, the chessboard is a great analogy because I think that he has a vision for what he wants to accomplish, but, you know, you can only see so far ahead. Even the best players don't see more than 4 or 5 moves ahead. And so I think what we're seeing is Russia asserting itself in areas that it considers important to its national interests, certainly Ukraine and now in Syria. And, you know, the tactics, you know, have proved to be quite effective. And whether or not they lead to the strategy or the ultimate goal, I think that remains to be seen.
So it's more than just sort of impulsive moves. Do you see any goal of restoration of either the Soviet Union or Tsarist Russia?
You know, I think that one of the things that he said, and I quoted in the book, is that, you know, anybody who wanted to see a return of the Soviet Union had no brain. But anybody who, you know, thought it was a good thing, the collapse, has no heart. And I don't ultimately think that Putin is trying to create some sort of new Cold War by restoring an ideological system, you know, opposed to the West, to capitalism and so forth. I do think he's reaching back in history, both to the Soviet Union, which is what he grew up in, and also to the Tsarist Russia, the empire, for aspects of a national identity that they're very much looking for still in Russia. You know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was 26 years ago now, there's still a struggle with what is Russia, you know, now that it's lost its states. And in his mind, he sees that as something that extends beyond Russia's natural borders to include all Russian peoples, many of whom ended up outside of the new Russia, you know, in places like Ukraine especially. So I think he's if you will, kind of like a buffet, choosing what he wants from the aspects of history that suit this idea that he and Russia are still very much in search of.
Interesting. A lot of people don't realize how sort of deflated the Russian status is now. The GNP is only the size of Italy, I think. So is there some psychological, you know, I'm going to be a bully here to make up for what looks like I'm not as big a guy on the street corner anymore?
Well, you know, if you look back to his youth, as you were saying earlier, you know, you can see aspects of that. He's not an imposing figure. He learned martial arts as a young boy, a teenager, tenaciously, he admits, because he wanted to defend himself. You know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the new Russian state was incredibly weak. It went through a tumultuous transition to a form of capitalism, but, you know, all of the institutions broke down, including the army. And, you know, in the first war in Chechnya in the 90s, the second war that began when Putin came to office, you know, the Russian military was a weakened, battered institution that really wasn't able to project much power, to be honest. It's certainly a pale echo of the Red Army from at least the height of the Cold War. And what Putin has done is set about trying to restore those institutions, especially in the military, to show once again that Russia can be tough. It has not caught up to the United States militarily, economically, of course not. But I think he's trying to get it back to a position where it can now, challenge U.S. interests. If you listen to what he was saying at the UN ahead of this move into Syria, he talked about the U.S. being able to do whatever it wanted around the world, including toppling governments, and that other countries were unable to stop them. And now he's saying Russia can, and I think that's what we're seeing in Syria. If you look at the air campaign that's underway right now, they're using about 36 planes. The American-led coalition has about 300. So it's still not a comparable, force. Yet nonetheless, it's having a great impact on the ground, and it's enough force to check the U.S.
Interesting. What going into Crimea, for instance, why would he do that? And why do you think the West would have been so acquiescent about it? And did he thought that move out that was inevitable? The West wouldn't be able to do anything.
This goes back to what you were saying about impulse, because I think that was an impulsive decision, and it was one made out of fear, and I think some ignorance, because he saw what was going on in Ukraine. If you remember, the government of the president had just fallen. He had fled the country. There were mass protests in the streets, and essentially a new government took over, elected by the parliament. But in Putin's mind, this was a coup, and it was a coup orchestrated from the outside, again, as he said in the United Nations a few weeks ago. And I think he looked at that and he said, there's this one part of Ukraine that has always been historically much closer to Russia. It was a conquest of Catherine the Great. The great Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy is based there and has been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he was told by his intelligence agencies that there would be a threat to that base, or at least to Russia's position in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, and he felt like he needed to do that. The question is, could anybody have stopped him? I think to do that would have required the use of force, and I don't think anybody in this city, but certainly other European capitals as well, had an appetite to go to war with Russia over Crimea.
Okay, let's get some answers to some of these big scope questions for people. How much do you think he's stolen?
Oh, that's a great question. People have tried to estimate.
Yeah.
And when you say stolen, you have to be, I think, somewhat careful. I don't think he has a big stash of cash in a Swiss bank somewhere or even in a Russian bank. But there's no question that he has exerted state control over companies that for a time were private, essentially expropriated them. And we saw that with the famous case of Yukos Oil Company and Russia's richest man at the time. There was another case with an oil company just last year. He's also used the power of the office to distribute contracts. And so in his now 16 years in power, you've seen new tycoons or oligarchs, as they call them, come to prominence, and many of them just coincidentally happen to be very close personal friends of Putin from his youth even. People that he was judo partners with as a teenager are now some of the richest men in Russia. So has he stolen it, or has he orchestrated, government contracts to, go to favored businesses and businessmen? I don't think there's much doubt about that. The question of, people will debate over how much of that is personal theft that's gone directly to him.
Mm-hmm. What's the scope of corruption overall? Now, you said the oligarchs, I think 1.29 of his cronies had 40% of the GDP, but what's the scope of the corruption in the whole system there?
Corruption is something when you live in Russia, you see literally every day. You see it in a police officer who will pull you over and let you go, even for a grievous offense, if you just give them enough money. If you need something from a government agency, that will often require paying a bribe. I refused to do it when I was there, and as a result, there's many frustrations I had dealing with the bureaucracies. But it's so infected in the system. Doctors will take bribes in order to get appointments for surgery and so forth. That's very much a tradition in Russia from the deprivation of the Soviet times, when you traded favors and access and stuff to get what you wanted, and that is lingering to this day. Critics will say that Putin has institutionalized that with the kind of contract rigging, directing payments and stuff to favored colleagues and so forth. That's a form of institutionalized corruption by most estimates, and of course it's really hard to estimate. The corruption is worse now than it's ever been in Russia.
All right, we've got about 40 seconds, so you have to be a very short answer at this point. We'll go deeper. Has he personally had people killed?
Oh, boy, that's an excellent question. I don't think so. I don't think that the way the system works, that he would leave his traces on any order that he had given.
All right. Of course, the mafia the top guy doesn't there either. All right, you're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell, coming to you on the Biz Talk Radio Network, over 300 stations around the country. Coming next, we'll talk about the rise of Vladimir Putin. We're talking with Stephen Lee Myers. He served as New York Times Russian correspondent for 7 years. Talk a little bit. I want to start with his youth and seeing where these patterns are, some impulsiveness, and but he was not a superstar fast developer either growing up or in his career. And I was interested that you said he was somewhat disinterested in his studies, et cetera, and Obama did that famous, he's like the bored kid in the back of the room.
I don't know how much research President Obama had done to come up with that line, or if it was just off the cuff, but he nailed an essential part of Putin, I think. In the descriptions, even his teachers who liked him would talk about how he was impulsive in class, he wasn't that serious, until the time that he became serious. He's able to devote himself to studies, and he did that when he was in the middle schools, because he very much wanted to join this judo club, and to do that he had to keep his grades up. And so he's able to turn it on when he needs to, but he did seem to be largely indifferent to the exercise, at least at times of studying. He went on to university, he got good grades, he got into a prestigious university. So he wasn't a completely indifferent student, but I think in terms of the seriousness with which he approached his studies, it wasn't always there.
Okay, it's interesting to me that, while the Soviet Union was collapsing, he was actually in East Germany, so that he was sort of away from it. Talk about the impact of being in East Germany and what it did, and what the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on him.
His intelligence career began in the KGB, and he spent first 10 years in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And, again, not a very spectacular career rise, including compared to some of the people that he's since remained friends with. He rose to the rank of major, which is not terribly high ranking after 10 years. If he was a superstar, he would have risen faster. And then he finally gets a chance to go to the finishing school for the KGB, the Red Banner Institute, which is in Moscow. And he goes there for a year. And normally, if you're going to be a spy sent undercover into the West, and given his language, German, it would have been West Germany or Austria or Switzerland, he would have expected to stay for 3 years. And he got himself into trouble and was kicked out after a year. It seemed to have been a fight that he had one time. Again, that impulsive behavior, rash, not thinking through the consequences always. And that sent him to East Germany after a year. In other words, he was sent to the trusted allies, the Stasi states. And he spent 5 years, quite liked the East Germans, working with the Stasi, who were even more notorious than the KGB was in terms of repressing their own people. And it was during that period, essentially coinciding with the rise of Gorbachev and the Perestroika era, that he served overseas and saw, I think, the changes that were going on in East German society. If you remember, with Perestroika happening in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of clamoring in the satellite states of Eastern Europe to also have an easing of the political system and an opening. And in all of those countries, it ended up ending the Soviet domination and the socialist experiment. And he witnessed all that firsthand, being in East Germany. And there's a great scene, one of the most important moments in his life, when the protesters overwhelmed the Stasi headquarters in Dresden, where he was stationed. And they were right next to the KGB villa where he had worked for 5 years. And he found himself, surrounded by a mob, and he describes it as a horrific, violent uprising. But, in fact, it was a few dozen people, and he was calling frantically to get reinforcements sent from the Soviet military base there. And the officer he got on the phone told him that he was unable to because Moscow was silent, that they had essentially offered no instructions for him to allow him to, reinforce the KGB villa. And Putin felt this was a tremendous betrayal, a failure of the state, forgetting everything else going on, the political, upswell that was happening in East Germany. And to this day, he sees the failure of the state as a catastrophe, as something that's quite dangerous because it unleashes these forces. And you see that very much in the way he talks about Syria now and the need to protect Assad.
Interesting. So then he comes back. He still doesn't get in the center of things in Moscow. He's in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, where he gets hands-on administrative experience as sort of a reformer, right?
It was interesting because he really felt the kind of end of his career when he came out of East Germany. Like, by the way, tens of thousands of other officers and later all the soldiers, who were deployed in East Germany, all came back. And had to find their way in Moscow or in Russia, the Soviet Union, at a time when it was going through tremendous pressures under perestroika, the backlash internally against perestroika. Finally, the coup, the attempted coup in August of '91 that hastened the end of the Soviet Union. And he experienced all this while in Leningrad. He was unable to get a prestigious job back in Moscow, which would have been the normal route for somebody who'd been overseas. So he ends up in a fairly low-ranking job at the university, overseeing dissidents there at the very end of the Soviet Union. But in this capacity, hooks up with one of the great Democrats of that era, Anatoly Sobchak, an ally of Boris Yeltsin, and he became a kind of mentor of Putin's. So this guy who had spent 15 years of his career in the KGB suddenly was working for one of the great Democrats, somebody he admired greatly, and it's sort of reflected in the conflicts that Putin has about both the Soviet instincts and the security services, but also this need for Russia to change and become something new. And he served him quite loyally until 96, when, much to Putin's dismay, his beloved boss, ends up losing his re-election campaign.
And ends up being kind of a crook as well. It was interesting, too, to me that Boris Berezovsky, one of the oligarchs, said that you couldn't bribe Putin back in St. Petersburg, and this seemed to change over time. How does he go from basically nowhere and no politics to basically number 2 under Yeltsin?
To me, is one of the most extraordinary periods of his career, because he shows up in Moscow basically out of a job in Leningrad, now Petersburg, and he relies on somebody who had been there before to get a fairly low-ranking job in the Kremlin administration, in the presidential administration. A decent job, but he's certainly not on a path to success. He was not a politician himself, never considered himself one. Very much of a technocrat or a bureaucrat. That was always the role that he played, kind of an enforcer, given his background. And in the short 3 years from August of 96 until August of 99, he steadily rose through the ranks of Yeltsin's administration, largely through accidents, I think, a twist of fate. Yeltsin was enfeebled at that point. There was a lot of turmoil inside his own administration. He would constantly fire his prime ministers. If you remember, he went through a stretch of 5 in a little more than a year. And each time that happened, Putin seemed to drift up from one post to the next one. He would replace somebody who had also been moved to a new job. And as a result, he ended up floating up to higher and higher positions and finally drew the attention of Yeltsin himself. And Yeltsin, who was enfeebled, as I said, was looking for a way to protect himself once his term came to an end, which was due in 2000 in March. There was supposed to be an election that spring, and he was looking around for somebody who could, essentially step into this job. And again, he'd been through so many prime ministers that when Putin was announced in August of '99, most people shrugged. They said, Vladimir who? And they expected that he would make it a few months at most, just like all the others before him.
We'll have more with Myers on Putin coming right up. We're talking with Stephen Lee Myers. He's the author of The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. First of all, are Putin and Russia one and the same now?
Putin has a political operative who works for him in the in the administration. He's actually a government official, not just a political advisor. And last year he had an extraordinary statement with a group of foreign analysts. He said, "There is Russia and there is Putin. Without Putin, there's no Russia." And that's an extraordinary statement.
It is.
I think it reflects the degree that not only that an acolyte, obviously is going to say something nice about his boss, but that that people in the political elite, such that it is anymore in Russia, can't conceive of somebody at the helm other than him. And what that says is that he hasn't created, or some would say he's destroyed, the institutions of government, including the parliament, the courts, business, independent business, the institutions that ensure continuity in a government, that he's created so much power in his own hands that little can be done without his consent, at least on important decisions. The government can be paralyzed. And that, in the event, eventually, that he steps down, who could also fulfill that role?
You said that, he didn't consider himself a politician, and obviously to me he wouldn't consider himself a businessman, but essentially he seems to have been hands-on structured the whole large corporate industry as to who's getting control, who doesn't. There's no rule of law or anything. And I guess if you keep your wealth out of trying to influence politics, you can keep it, otherwise he takes it.
There's no question about the control that he has reimposed over certainly important strategic industries. That includes oil and gas, of course, but also minerals, the railroads, these kinds of crucial parts of the economy that he doesn't trust to market forces, especially in a globalized economy where foreigners could come in and take over what he considers to be natural resources, the natural treasure of Russia. And so for that reason, he has imposed this statist vision of the economy. It's not quite a planned economy anymore. There are certainly aspects of capitalism there, the trade certainly. There's a lot of money, a lot of billionaires in Russia now who are trading in legitimate businesses overseas, banking and so forth. There are a lot of illegitimate ones as well, and accusations of money laundering, a lot of offshore corporations, which sometimes are impossible to untangle, but end up in the hands of people very close to Putin. Some say Putin himself. So I think he was being somewhat disingenuous when he said he wasn't a businessman at heart, but I think also that he doesn't see himself as a businessman as much as the regulator in the center of it all, approving deals. He does seem to he has an incredible command of detail, talking about something like a pipeline deal with China. I mean, you can get into the cost per 1,000 cubic meters of gas and the pricing of it, and the laws governing pipelines. And he does seem to like the wheeling and dealing, if you will. I sometimes wonder if that's why Donald Trump expressed admiration for him. The art of the deal, and in a way, I think more even than being a natural politician, he never really has had to campaign for any position that he's had, even the first one, because he doesn't debate his opponents. Elections really are a farce now in Russia. They're just a formality, an exercise that you go through every 4 and now 6 years for the presidential term. But the business of when it comes to where the rubber hits the road, if you will, that's where he's very much involved in all major deals.
Is democracy basically dead? And in the long run, can you run a nation as a corrupt sort of criminal state without really a rule of law?
People will tell you can't. And one of the things, I think to be a thriving democracy, you have to have rule of law. You have to have some ability to adjudicate disputes between people. You have to have some trust in the institutions of law enforcement, so that the police aren't corrupt, so that your company, if you invest in a business, even a small business like a restaurant, that somebody won't just come and steal it from you, and you have no recourse. This happens all the time there. And somehow the economy manages to continue on, though it's stumbling now, especially with oil being so low and the sanctions that have been imposed after Ukraine. But I don't see how it's sustainable in the long run without there being some reform, some opening of the system. At the end of the day, people in Putin's government will tell you that that's what they want to do. And yet they've been saying that since he first took office 16 years ago.
It's interesting because it gets back to where we started. People say that he's out chess playing Obama all the time. But is Obama right when he says that really the guy's playing a weak hand and he's going to end up overreaching and he's destroying his own economy because of the oil price collapse?
I don't want to get into a debate between Obama and Putin, but I'll tell you I think that Obama's comments are somewhat self-serving as well.
Obviously,
he wants to defend
his lack of action.
His policies, the lack of action, especially in the case of Syria. I do think Putin is playing a weak hand in Syria, yet he's playing a hand. And there's, I think, in the action that Russia has taken, at least a clarity to what the immediate goal is. Long term, I'm not sure he yet knows what the solution to the war in Syria will be. I don't think anybody knows. I mean, the United States and European allies have been trying for a long time to broker some kind of ceasefire there, and it's been a mess. And it may resist Russian efforts to resolve it as well. But at least in the immediate, Russia's position is anybody who's taken up a weapon against this Assad government is a terrorist, and we have to first stop them. And then you can worry about the Islamic State. They're only part of the problem. If without a central government, and this goes back to his experience in Dresden, his experience in Russia with the collapse of the Soviet Union, without a powerful central authority, without the law enforcement services in control, you'll have chaos. And he is defending that principle.
Let me ask you, and I don't know if you had a chance to interview Putin or whatever, but there's a famous George W. Bush. I looked into his soul, and this is someone I could trust at least at one time. And then there's the McCain. I looked into his soul, and I saw KGB. Do you have a sense of the man?
I do. I have met him a couple times. We had an interview with him with the New York Times about 10 years ago now. And, I have looked into his eyes. I'm not sure I got the same sense of the soul that Bush saw in him. I saw not a charming man. I was not won over by him. I saw a very cold, calculating guy. I wouldn't say a killer. I wouldn't say that at all. A very serious, even humorless person, certainly in the context of talking to the New York Times. He was not going to be effusive, and he had his points to make. But also incredible command of detail. Spent 3.5 hours with us, answered all our questions. He was irritated when I asked him if he regretted any aspects of his KGB career. Defensive a little bit about that, but somebody who's definitely had a command of the issues.
You've said that you don't think that he personally gets his hands involved in having people killed or whatever, but we'll go through some of these guys at some point. But Boris Nemtsov, an opposition leader, was assassinated within the shadow of the Kremlin. And how can that happen without some level of acquiescence somewhere in the leadership?
I don't doubt that there was some level of acquiescence in the leadership. I don't doubt that at all. And I find the response the Kremlin often gives in these high-profile cases disingenuous. They say, only somebody who wanted to discredit Russia would kill somebody.
Right.
And frankly, that excuse is worn out to me at this point. I knew Boris Nemtsov. He was a great man, a funny guy. Some people once talked about him being a future president of Russia. I think that was dreaming a little bit. But he was a real patriot. He believed in Russia. He worked hard for Russia. He believed in democracy. He didn't think the Russian people needed to have an iron fist holding them back.
Did he worry about his safety?
He did at the end. And he also, though, told me that his place was in Russia to fight. I saw him just a few months before he was killed. And, we had a long talk about people who had left the country, because many were after Crimea, and the increasing pressure on the opposition that followed that. And he said, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to continue to fight. One of the things that most people forgot or overlooked about him, Nemtsov, at the end, because he was very prominent as a national figure, but he had gotten himself elected in a regional election, which the Kremlin controls a little bit less, to the local parliament in Yaroslavl, a region just north of Russia, of Moscow, forgive me. And, he argued that by having that position, One, it gave him immunity from prosecution, so if they wanted to bring up a trumped-up case against him, he would have some measure of protection. But also because he thought if you're inside the system, you can fight it. And he did that by publishing the budgets that the local governor would propose and ask, why do we need 24 Mercedes? And wasn't going to bring down the government. It wasn't going to bring down Putin. But it was a clever way to stop at least one corrupt deal that was going to reward a bunch of deputies and that.
I always think that when I hear that Putin said we're going to go get these guys who are doing bad things, making us look bad by making it look like we set this guy up, is like O.J. looking for the killer. We'll have more with Myers on Putin coming right up. We're talking with Stephen Lee Myers, again, the author of The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. What are some of the reforms that you think Russia, I should say, needs to try to do to, as you said before, this in the long run, this can't go on the way it is?
I think that there are many layers to that question, but starting first with the economy, with the oil prices falling again, and understanding this is a cycle, someday they'll rise again, but Russia needs to get off of its dependency on oil and gas as the principal supplier of its budget. And, again, people inside the government for years have been saying they need to do that. They need to create opportunities for other kinds of businesses to form small businesses, even large businesses. And I think that's the principal one. When the fiscal crisis hit in 2008 and 2009, Russia took a real hard hit, the worst of the G20 countries. And, again, then everybody said, we need to ease up the system. We need to create rule of law. We need to have corporate protections and so forth. And as soon as the price of oil rises again, the momentum for that is lost. I think that's the main thing. On the economy, I think the other thing is the notion of fighting the corruption, which I think comes from having an open political system. Even if it's not a freewheeling democracy like we have, but at least having some competition in the parliament so that, the parliament can ask questions the way Nemtsov was. Why are we doing this? Why are we pursuing this policy? Why are we raising pensions? Why aren't we raising pensions? Those political discussions, which I think are at the root of any democracy, simply don't happen now. Everything is decided very much from the top, from the Kremlin at least, and imposed on everyone else. And sometimes they make mistakes and the public gets upset and they kind of respond to that or they back off. But more often than not, they just ignore it and plow ahead. Without a free media, without an independent judiciary that's able to mediate disputes, corporate disputes and so forth, I don't see there being much hope for the Russian economy in the long run.
All right, on the chessboard, Ukraine, Syria, Chechnya even before that, Crimea, is there a next move that might happen, Kazakhstan or something else?
The interesting thing about Syria is that it's the first Russian military operation outside of the former Soviet Union since the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 1991. So I think that is a real test of both their military but also their political standing in the world. They don't have the wherewithal, I don't think, to exert power globally right now. And I'm not sure, given the situation in Ukraine and now, a hot conflict in Syria, that Putin has the capacity to continue picking fights. A lot of people worry about that. Mm-hmm. Our NATO allies in the Baltic states and Poland very much worry about this. And, I think they see Russia's belligerence much more ominously than other capitals in Europe. Though I think their message got across after the Crimea annexation. There's definitely been a beefing up of NATO forces in the Baltic region and in Eastern Europe, and I think that probably will have a deterrent effect right now. But I very much see, Russia's talking about putting a base in Belarus, which is a very close ally, but also probably not willing to be quite that close to Russia, that embrace anyway. And same in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan looked at what happened in Crimea and thought, there's a portion of Kazakhstan that is largely Russian. Are they going to be annexed next? I think Putin doesn't want to push it too far at any given moment. Again, very tactical. He's going to look for opportunities, and so I would expect the more likely scenario would be some sort of unrest in one of the regional states like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan,
and then use
even
that
in
as
Georgia, and then rushing in
Yeah.
through the alliances that he does have, to bolster these countries, and then essentially never leaving.
You would think that he would have institutional memory of the quagmire they got into in Afghanistan. So now he goes into Syria. Essentially means he's siding with the Sunnis and the Shiite Sunni thing, plus getting into the Middle East. Is he getting himself into a quagmire?
I think it's easy to look at the Afghanistan example, but, the Soviet Union poured 100,000 troops and occupied all of Afghanistan. And what Putin has done is much shorter of that. As I said earlier, he's put in 36 planes and a couple thousand troops essentially to provide force protection for the aircraft that are there. That's not an Afghan-style invasion, and I don't think it will be. You'll see that. He's doing essentially what the United States has been able to do since the Gulf War in 1990, which is precision power, limited but effective use of air power and airstrikes, cruise missiles, and so forth. And I think he's hoping to be able to turn the tide with that limited engagement. He himself has ruled out putting in troops there. So I think it's too soon to say that it's going to be a quagmire, though I don't see an easy solution to this conflict anytime soon, which will require Russian forces to be involved for some time to come.
You mentioned in the book that his term goes to 2018 and he could go to 2024. What's going to happen? How long is he going to be there? Who's going to succeed him?
I have no doubt that in 2018 he will once again stand for election, at which point it's a formality, not just because he's popular, but also because the system is created such that no real opposition is allowed to run. So the election is his to win. It's really just an affirmation vote from the public. The question then will be after 6 more years, in 2024, 9 years from now, he will face the end constitutionally of his term in office and face the kind of question he did in 2008, which was, would he anoint a successor or rewrite the Constitution? And, he did not rewrite the Constitution. He essentially orchestrated his protege to take over for him, served loyally as president for 4 years, with Putin still really the paramount leader.
Ran everything.
In the country.
Yeah.
I don't think he ran everything. I think there was a division of labor there, and that was partly why Putin came back, because he didn't trust Medvedev enough to keep things together. So there was a division of labor, but ultimately the veto power rested with Putin. And the question now, and I've talked to people about this close to him, is he now looking for that successor again? Everyone's always speculating. Medvedev remained as prime minister, so he's still around. Other people close to Putin, like Sergei Ivanov, who's the essentially chief of staff of the administration, he's still around. They're all still relatively young men, and you could see one of them also being groomed. But again, it's 9 years from now.
Are you bullish or pessimistic on Russia's future?
Generally, I'm an optimist, but I don't see a lot of reasons for that looking at Russia today.
All right, thanks to Stephen Lee Myers. A great interview. It's a great book, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. It's published by Knopf. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Podcasts are available at iTunes. Search Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Stephen Lee Myers. Thanks to our national audience for listening. And we'll see you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is Segment 5 Overtime exclusively for Yale Radio, WYBC. Thanks to Bill for staying with us. Bill Browder is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital. He was one of the first and then was the largest foreign investor in Russia. What's your mission going forward?
So my mission going forward is several things. We have sort of 3 prongs in our campaign for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. The first is what I call the political prong, which is visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed him. And we've succeeded in getting that done under the Magnitsky Act in the United States. However, we're still only halfway through the process in Europe. And these Russian crooks love to go to Europe. They're all over the place in Paris and on the Côte d'Azur, in the Italian Riviera. They come to London, and they really value going to Europe. And so that's a real great sanction to impose on them if we can succeed. But it's also very much harder to do because the Europeans don't have the same sense of right and wrong as the Americans do, and so it's much harder to get politicians energized the way I've done in America. I don't think it's impossible, and I'm going to carry on, and we've gotten a lot of great politicians behind us, but we're dealing with a much more cynical group of people in the European part of the world than in America. The second thing we're doing is what I call the criminal justice prong, which is we are going after the people who stole the money that led to Sergei Magnitsky being murdered, and we're working with different law enforcement agencies all over the world to find that money and to seize it, not for us, but have the police seize it. And so far we've been reasonably successful. We've got the Swiss prosecutor to seize $20 million at Credit Suisse and UBS. We've got the U.S. Department of Justice. The U.S. Department of Justice has acted on this on the information that we gave them, and then we also have the Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian prosecutors opening up criminal cases, the Cyprus prosecutor, and in the end, we want to make life as unpleasant as possible for the people who did this, so that they can't enjoy their ill-gotten gains and the blood money that they got. And then the third prong is this book. I wrote this book to tell the story. I wrote this book in a way that regular people will want to read this story. And I wrote this book, so if you read the first 10 pages of it, you'll read the whole book. And at the moment, I'm happy to say that it's getting a lot of attention. It's a bestseller on the New York Times list. And for me, I want a lot of people to know what happened to Sergei and to know what's going on in Russia, and to have an interesting read and an enjoyable, fast read to get there. And that's what this book is all about. And then the final part of of that third prong is that we're going to adapt the book into a movie, and that's just beginning.
That's funny. I was going to ask if we had time yet of segment 4, because it would certainly lend itself to a movie. And every chapter is amazing, because as bad as it gets, you can't believe that it could get any worse, and it gets worse in each subsequent chapter. I might mention, if I get this right from your book, your dad taught math at Yale, right?
My dad taught math at Yale. Indeed, he was a math professor there. Okay,
let's move forward. You said you changed some of the names in the book. Did you change a lot? What kinds of how do you think you're being monitored now?
Well, Russia has this organization called the FSB, which is the successor organization to the KGB, and this is a secret police, and they have a lot of people on their payroll, both inside of Russia and in the West, and they go after enemies of the state, and so I'm considered acknowledged and considered to be an enemy of the state. And so they look at all different things they can find out about me and try to find ways to hurt me, discredit me, compromise me, and potentially kidnap me or kill me. And so when there's certain information that I don't want them to have, and so we try to limit their access to that information. And a couple of the names have been changed in the book to limit that information. I would say that 80% of the names are all the same, but there's still some names that we wanted to change for reasons of people's personal safety.
Do you have security around you all the time?
Well, I don't go into how I secure myself, for the obvious reason that if my enemies know that, then they'll make countermeasures. But suffice to say that the life that I live is a lot different than a regular person's life because of this terrible enemy I have.
Can you travel freely?
I can travel freely to certain countries, and other countries I can't. I've been convicted and sentenced in absentia in Russia to 9 years in prison on trumped-up charges after we got the Magnitsky Act passed. And that means that if a country that I want to go to is friendly with Russia, then they will arrest me and hand me back to Russia. And so I've got to be very careful about which countries I go to, so I don't go to a country which will hand me over to Russia so that I'll be tortured and killed like my poor deceased lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky.
You had an informer who was sort of keeping your folks abreast as these developments are going on. I think Aslan was the name, and he was killed as well.
Well, we had several informers. Aslan is still alive and well. There was another informer, a guy who was a member. He was a member of the criminal enterprise, who fell out with the criminal enterprise, and then they tried to have him imprisoned in Russia. He fled the country, came to the UK, and then handed over a lot of documents to us, which led to the opening of this criminal case in Switzerland and freezing of money. And this man became a cooperating witness. His name is Alexander Perpolichny. He became a cooperating witness with the Swiss Attorney General in their prosecution against Russian organized crime. And about a year and a half after he did that, he was jogging outside his house in Surrey, which is a suburb of London, and he dropped dead at the age of 44 in perfect health before that. And we don't know exactly what happened to him. I believe that he was poisoned in some way, which caused his death. But to this day, there's no cause of death. But the coroner hasn't been able to determine a cause of death.
Now, Boris Berezovsky was one of these oligarchs who stole his way to billions, and then I guess he became anti-Putin at some point. Litvinenko was poisoned in London. Also, I think was an oligarch who turned or was turned out by Putin. Do you have theories of those cases?
I mean, I think that all these people were killed. It's just too much of a coincidence that all the enemies of Putin are killed, and Litvinenko is obviously killed with polonium, and this is like Hansel and Gretel. There's a little trail of polonium that goes all the way back to Moscow, all the way on the British Airways flight and everything. I mean, it's ridiculous. They didn't cover their tracks very well. And Berezovsky is a little bit more of a sophisticated story, but I've met this guy once or twice, and he wasn't a good man, but he was also not the kind of guy who would kill himself. And it all just seems a little bit too convenient that one of Putin's most outspoken critics just suddenly drops dead from supposed suicide. Just doesn't make sense to me.
I want to, because we didn't have time before, just to show you how brazen this is, have you talk a little bit about Gazprom and how the CEO gives away hundreds of millions to his family. And I want you to talk too about Price Waterhouse. We happened to have the vice chairman on last week. Price Waterhouse signs off on their financials with this stuff going on. And how do they get away? How does even the stock exchange, when so much corruption is going on, how do they get away with it?
Well, so let's just go back. So Gazprom, when we were looking at it in 1999, we decided to do something called the stealing analysis to figure out how much money was being stolen out of Gazprom. And we did a very detailed forensic analysis that took about 3 months to do, working with a lot of different people to get the information. And we were able to determine that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait had been stolen off of Gazprom's balance sheet. And as you mentioned, one of those gas fields actually was sold to the brother of the CEO and his son, and various other insiders got other gas fields. And it was just the most egregious, high-level, huge scam I've ever seen. And then what was most interesting, as you mentioned, that then you had a public accounting firm signing off on their audit, saying it's all okay. And the way that they could get away with it back then was that in Russia the whole place was bent from top to bottom, and there was no regulator, there was no police, the politicians, the auditors weren't doing their job. Everyone was just pretending, and. But that was why Gazprom traded at a 99.7% discount to Exxon per barrel of reserves.
You can't make it up. I think Kordovsky was the head of Yukos Oil, and he becomes an opponent of Putin, and Putin just has him arrested and takes 50% of the company. Did I have that right?
No, more than that. They have him arrested and takes 100% of his company. Everything got taken away. After he got arrested and they took 100% of his company, the rest of the oligarchs panicked, and they went to Putin and said, well, what do we have to do to make sure you don't do that to us? And he said, just give me 50% and I won't arrest you. And so that's when Putin became the richest man in the world.
Wow. You've also had some big-time mentors who met with strange deaths, but they're interesting people, so maybe give us a little bit about them and what you think happened. But you worked with Robert Maxwell first.
Yeah, so at the early stages of my career, when I set out to become an investor in Eastern Europe, this was my dream when I was in my late 20s. I had a job with this famous man named Robert Maxwell, who turned out to be the biggest fraudster in England, and I worked for him for about a year and a half, and and he had this enormous scam going where he was stealing money from the pension fund to fund his lifestyle and to support the share price of his companies so that he could borrow more money. And one day when I was coming back from lunch, I saw this red headline on my Reuters screen, and it said, "Maxwell missing at sea." And I had an office mate at the time, and I thought he had been joking around somehow and figured out some kind of prank. And I looked at him and said, "How do you do that?" And he said, "I didn't do anything." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And at that point I realized that Maxwell, this wasn't a practical joke, that Maxwell, the boss, was missing at sea. And it turned out that Robert Maxwell, who had a big yacht, he was off the coast of Madeira in the near Spain, and either he fell, he jumped, or he was pushed off his boat. And right at the moment that the whole world was going to discover that he was the biggest fraudster in England, the British equivalent to Madoff back in those days, and it all hell broke loose after that. And it was very hard for me to find a job coming from Maxwell's, but eventually I ended up at Salomon Brothers.
I'm actually going to visit Madoff in prison. I've been communicating with him coming up. The other big renowned guy, Edmund Safra.
So after a couple of years at Salomon Brothers, when I first started investing in Russia, and I discovered how cheap the shares were, I decided to break out on my own and start my own investment fund. And I went out to meet a bunch of big investors, and one of those investors was Edmund Safra. Edmund Safra was the owner of Republic National Bank of New York, and considered by most to be the sort of the best private banker in the world. He was the guy that everybody went to if they wanted to keep their money safe. And I went to Edmund Safra, and he liked the proposal that I put in front of him about investing in Russia, and so he became my first big investor and my joint venture partner in my company, Hermitage Capital, which went on to he put up the first $25 million, and it eventually became a $4.5 billion fund. And unfortunately, a couple years into our relationship, he sold his bank and sold his interests to a big British bank called HSBC. So he wasn't involved anymore. And like about 6 months after that, I got a terrible phone call one night from one of his associates tell me that he had been in a terrible situation in his home where he wasn't well, and he had a male nurse, who created a fake home invasion at his home, and it started a little fire. And this nurse wanted to somehow create an invasion and then save him from the invasion or something like that. And so this fire started, and so Safra goes into the safe room of his house with another nurse. They're in the safe room, and the fire then starts burning out of control. And the firemen come, and they want him to leave the safe room, but he won't leave because his bodyguards have always told him, you only come out when the bodyguards tell you to come out. But his bodyguards were Israeli. They didn't speak French. They spoke English and Hebrew. And the firemen wouldn't let them in, and so he couldn't get out, and he died of smoke inhalation in the safe room, and it was a terrible tragedy. And I lost a great man, a mentor, and someone who I was really sad to lose.
And you don't suspect more foul play there? And Maxwell, do you think was suicide or?
Maxwell, I really don't know. It seemed to me to be suicide for one simple reason, because he was about to be publicly exposed as the biggest fraudster in history. But there's a lot of people that have other theories, and I'm not close enough to the evidence to know, but the external information would point to suicide.
Give us a sense of what this is like to live through. You took that initial $25 million you just talked about and turned it almost instantly into $1 billion. And then you had your fund suffer a 90% decline. What was that like?
Well, basically, all of these crazy moves up and down, financial moves up and down, were just so far beyond my own experience beforehand. It was just it was almost like an out-of-body experience. It was amazing when we were making the money and just devastating when we were losing it. And to lose 90% of your money when you have $1 billion, even if most of the money was profits, is still just the most horrific, physically painful thing that could ever happen. And in a certain way, it's kind of ruined me for life as an investor, because I kind of think that everything has the possibility of going down 90%. So I'm much more hesitant about investing in things than a person who hasn't had that experience. Kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder in the investing world.
And I must say, he drove it back up to 4.5 billion. Are you running Hermitage now as a hedge fund, or what are you doing?
Well, so my human rights activities have been an important priority for me, and so I run a family office now, investing my own money. I give the capital back to my clients, and I spend my I spend my time trying to make sure that the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky don't get away with it.
And are you investing still in Eastern Europe? Those kinds of areas?
Not at all. After this terrible experience, my focus now is on places where there's a rule of law, where property rights, where there's stable politics, and so 80% of my money is in the United States, and the rest is in Western Europe. Looking
back, where all this ended up playing out, obviously very successful on the Hermitage side. Do you regret doing the whole thing?
If I could turn back the clock and do something different, I would do that in a heartbeat to avoid this whole thing, this terrible tragedy.
What does you've obviously running an investment business and then becoming a human rights activist are obviously very different cultures and skill sets. What's it been like transitioning to that?
Well, it's everything is a challenge. Everything is different. I think everything sort of the 10,000 hour rule applies, which is you get really good at something if you spend enough time at it. For me, I enjoyed the investment business. I think it was interesting and it was intellectually stimulating. But in terms of what's most meaningful, fighting for justice is a lot more meaningful than fighting for money. And I really do. I feel like I have a righteous mission trying to right this terrible wrong.
Money laundering and these secretive banks, say in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, other places. Does that need to change to basically get at sort of the all the financial stealing that comes out of Russia and gets put into these secret havens?
Yeah, I think that there's a whole big global problem which is very, very hard to attack, which is all these different havens, these regulators that don't regulate, these lack of transparency in these places where you can't figure out who owns the companies and so on. And so the world is really sort of a haven. There's a lot of places that are havens for money launderers, and there needs to be much more aggressive legislation to prevent all this stuff from happening. And we're nowhere near, for us to, for money launderers, they can, in one day, they can move money between 5 different countries and 20 different companies, and then it takes like 5 years to unravel it because of all the lack of cooperation with law enforcement agencies between countries and all the bureaucracy and so on. And so there needs to be a better system, more transparent system, so that this stuff is easier to prosecute.
Now, you talked about sort of the weakness in Western leaders, whether it's Obama or the Prime Minister of England, the Chancellor in Germany. What do you think they should be doing? Because obviously cutting off relations, things like that, might be dangerous. What do you think realistically they should be doing?
Well, Putin is not a man to negotiate. If you negotiate with him, he breaks his promises, he lies, he just pushes forward. He's a guy to be contained, not negotiated with. And so basically we need to look at what are our leverage points with him. One of them is that the Ukrainians are ready to go to war. They are at war, and we should give them every bit of mechanical equipment help that they're asking for, so that they can fend off the Russians. Because if we don't, they'll be taken over pretty soon, and then the Russians will be at the Baltics, where we then have to decide whether we want to engage Russia ourselves with NATO. We should also unplug Russia from the SWIFT banking system, so that the Russian banks can't connect with Western banks. I think that would be a devastating blow to them and take away a lot of resources that they would otherwise have to be on these military adventures.
Now,
and then the last thing is that,
sorry.
The last thing I would say is that there's a bunch of oligarchs out there that are holding Putin's money, and I think that the top 100 oligarchs in Russia should have their money frozen in the West. I think if you did those three things, it would really put a serious dent in their whole, the momentum and their enthusiasm for doing this, because they would just have a lot less resources to do all this terrible stuff with.
Those are great points. What about with our increase in domestic oil and shale oil? Really, Russia's the GDP is only the size of Italy, and they're very dependent on oil revenues. Is there economic warfare that we should consider?
Well, I don't think we have to. It's it's in our interest to develop shale gas and oil in America, and we should do that with full enthusiasm. The Saudis are playing along for their own reasons, whatever they may be, and I don't think that we have to do anything in this area. That oil prices are down, and they'll probably be down for a while. And so I think we're and you're right. This is a major blow to the Russian economy. Major blow.
Well, you're certainly doing God's work, and we hope that you remain safe, and whatever security measures you're using, keep with them. Thanks to Bill Browder for a great hour, and the book is Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice. You won't be able to put it down. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated on the Business Talk Radio Network. Again, next week we'll talk about too big to jail, the next step from too big to fail, I guess. Thanks again to Bill. Thanks to our loyal Yale audience for staying with us. See you next Sunday.